Hello and welcome to Electric Cars, the Future and Tax Benefits. Please let me introduce to you the two lovely gentlemen that will be speaking to us today. We have Mark Constable from Trojan Energy Limited, and we have Matt Reed from McBride's. We have had the wonderful pleasure of actually having Mark talk to a school for us across this Bexley Eco Festival week. And I tell you, the kids were beyond engaged. So I am super excited for this session, and there's nothing more I can say, but do feel free to take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Chelsea, for that incredibly warm welcome. Thank you to you and Fiona and Andrea, of course, for organising the festival and allowing me to come and speak in this slot today. So, yeah, this is the electric cars slot. You've got myself and Matt, who will be talking a little bit later on in the session. So what are we covering today? I'm going to talk a little bit about the four kind of historical eras of electric cars. I'm going to talk a little bit about who the current players are, who are driving the electric vehicle kind of market forward around the world. I'll talk a little bit about the UK switch and how electric cars have evolved in the UK over the last decade. And then coming a little bit closer to home, and might be of interest of people who are thinking about getting an EV, how do they work? How do they drive? How do you live with one, including charging and running costs, what the impact of EVs is, and some of the challenges associated with their existence. And then I'm going to hand over to Matt, who's got a lot of fantastic information about EV, tax incentives and the financials around them, which should be said is helping to drive a lot of the uptake in the UK. So the 20-second version on me, I used to lead EDF Energy's EV business. If anyone knows the Broadway in Bexley Heath, I spent 10 years working at Heath House, which is the large EDF Energy office near the roundabout with Albion Road. More recently, I've led Transport for London's commercial EV infrastructure programme, but in May, I joined Trojan Energy to become the head of business development, because they've got a very, very innovative charging solution, and we're really looking forward to rolling that out, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So the brief history of electric vehicles. So EVs are actually not a new thing at all. In the late 19th century, the world was largely steam powered. Brunel had steam powered ships, Stevenson had steam powered steam engines. EVs actually predated petrol cars. You can see this fantastic bussy electric cab. This vehicle is actually on display in the Science Museum on the ground floor out the back. 1891, 30 miles of range at a top speed of 6 miles an hour, wet cell batteries, but is actually much more similar to EVs of today than you might think. Coming into the early and mid 20th century, oil refining effectively improved, and effectively the power of oil companies in the oil industry around the world started to build, and effectively petrol and diesel engines took over, particularly in smaller vehicles. And EVs became limited to what we now know as we call neighbourhood EVs, but what everybody else in the world probably calls milk floats, short range vehicles that needed to operate quietly. And for about 60 to 70 years, that was effectively what an electric vehicle was. It was a milk float. Coming through into the late 20th century with rising environmental awareness amongst people and companies, amongst the rest of us, General Motors created the EV1 program, which is a very interesting little two-seater sports car. Still stands up very well against the specifications of today. That car effectively came out around about 1987, and then they killed the program. They leased a few prototype cars, people wanted to keep them, they recalled them all, took them apart, crushed them, and never spoke of them again. There's a couple of really interesting films called Revenge of the Electric Car and Who Killed the Electric Car, all about that program. And then coming forward, bang, right up to date, two things happened. There was effectively a breakthrough in battery technology, and then the idea of an EV became possible. And then as a result of that, governments around the world started to bring in vehicle CO2 and emissions legislation, and that's effectively what we've got today. So the reason that EVs have taken off now, it's not because people and companies have decided to build them. It's not because the technology is better. It's simply because of laws. California was the first government in the world to create car emissions limits on CO2 in 2004. And then the EU came along a few years later and created some CO2 fleet limits for car makers that come into effect in 2020 and 2025. More than anything else, that's what's driven the electric vehicle uptake that we've seen around the world currently. Car makers needed zero emission vehicles in their model ranges to attain a fleet average, and that meant they had to put some effort in. And so who were the key players who put that effort in? And we're kind of talking round about between 2005 and 2010 is where the R&D really came from. So you can see that was my first EV. I drove that in October 2008. That was Toyota's prototype plug-in Prius. They never put it on sale. Interesting to see that with Toyota now having a focus on hydrogen, that they are a long way behind, but they were one of the front runners kind of 10 to 15 years ago in kind of electric vehicle research. Another front runner was BMW, who created a fleet of 600 prototype United States specification minis, completely not saleable to the public. The entire back of the car was battery. There was no luggage space at all, no rear seats. But they created 600 of those. I was lucky enough to have one for a little while, and they also formed the backbone of the electric London 2012 Olympic fleet. If anyone remembers the Olympics, people may have seen a lot of those running around London at that time. Nissan were the first company to put a battery electric vehicle on sale. In kind of early 2011, the Nissan Leaf came into being, and at the time it was the only viable kind of large size EV that was available. And soon after, Nissan started to make them in the UK in Sunderland. And also General Motors, who were still smarting from a lot of criticism that they received over the EV1 program, came along with a slightly different vehicle called the Chevrolet Volt, which was sold in Britain as the Vauxhall Ampera. And that was a range extended electric vehicle, which had an interesting combination of a battery and a petrol engine, which we'll talk a little bit more about as we go through. But of course, there's one company that I've not mentioned, and they've probably done more than any other company to drive electric vehicles into being, whereas all other companies have tried to follow them. All other companies have learned from them. Tesla actually worked with a lot of companies as well. And you know, it's fair to say that, you know, Elon Musk is somebody who has, you know, probably done more than any other single person to further the cause of e-mobility anywhere in the world. You know, he's a complicated guy. You know, he's got some interesting personal qualities, but his kind of contribution and what Tesla have contributed to effectively the switch in mobility is, you know, can't be disputed. Interestingly, yesterday, Tesla finally put the Model Y, which is their newest vehicle, into order in the UK. So you can buy one for delivery early 2021. And I can't argue with Elon when he says that this car will effectively become the best-selling EV around the world. And it will also outsell all other Teslas in due course. And it's a vehicle that's been effectively awaited by, you know, a lot of people interested in EVs for some time. So that's kind of a little potted history on the kind of the organisations involved. Now, some people on the call might be relatively, you know, unfamiliar with EVs. You know, I've been working in EVs for more than 10 years, so it's easy for me to become complacent and start using jargon, and there is an awful lot of it, I'm afraid to say. So a few of the terms that are involved, sometimes I'll talk about a BEV. That's a battery electric vehicle, sometimes referred to as a full electric vehicle. That's just got a battery and an electric motor and nothing else, such as that nice Ford Mustang Mach-E there. There's also what we call a PHEV, which is a plug-in hybrid EV, which is effectively a dual powertrain vehicle. So it's got an electric motor probably a small battery, but it's also got a combustion engine with a gearbox that connects directly to the drive shaft. So you've effectively got what is called a hybrid powertrain. So the wheels can be driven either electrically or by mechanical power. There's also one slightly rarer kind of type of vehicle, which kind of, for purposes, tends to get lumped in with plug-in hybrids, which is a range extended EV, such as the Chevrolet Volt, my old BMW i3 there, and also the LEVC London Taxi. If you've got one of the electric taxis in London, there are about 5,000 of them now. That's a range extended EV. That's where the car is always driven electrically, but there is a small combustion engine which does nothing but effectively recharge the battery. So the combustion engine is not connected to the wheels via any kind of transmission, simply charges the battery. And then a PIV is effectively a plug-in vehicle, which is a combination of all of those. So that's some of the jargon and the terminology that we kind of talk about. So how have EVs effectively grown in the UK over the last 10 years? So the thing that effectively kick-started the UK market was in September 2011, the UK government put together what was called the plug-in car grant. That was effectively £5,000 off the purchase cost of an EV. Back then, it was only the Nissan Leaf that was on sale, and then the Vauxhall Ampera came along after. And for the first kind of 5 to 6 years, EV uptake was actually very, very low. In fact, you can see there that by the time you go to kind of September 2016, we're still kind of way less than kind of 100,000 vehicles. As it happens, now we in the last registration plate change, we sold 46,000 EVs in the month. You know, the biggest, by far the biggest monthly kind of jump in vehicles. But you can see there was quite a nice kind of slow kind of acceleration in the curve until you get to about kind of the first half of 2020, and then suddenly the number of vehicle choices came onto the market and everything skyrocketed, and the market started to seriously accelerate. I won't dwell too long on this graph. It's a little bit busy, but all it really says is the market started out being all battery electric vehicles. Then the Mitsubishi Outlander was launched, and PHEVs effectively overtook in kind of the middle of May 14. The majority of PHEVs being sold lasted until kind of mid kind of 2019, when the Tesla Model 3 was launched, and then BEVs started effectively becoming in the majority again, to the extent that last month more than half the plug-in vehicles for the first time in about 6 years are now battery electric vehicles, and battery electric vehicles are growing much faster than PHEVs now. Incidentally, the Tesla Model 3 is now the best-selling battery electric vehicle, having only been on sale in the UK for just over 2 years. In terms of the growth, the thing that drives the market more than anything else is product. There are lots of other things which I'll just briefly touch on, but the thing that really makes effectively people go out and buy an electric vehicle is the presence of an electric vehicle that they want to buy, and there are four main factors associated in that: the purchase price coming down, the range and the size of the battery going up, somebody's chosen brand deciding to launch an EV, and having a wider range of vehicles and vehicle types. It is fair to say that a lot of EVs, early EVs in the market, have a kind of an SUV style platform or a crossover platform. The reason for that is the batteries are normally sandwiched into the floor, and so a taller vehicle gives manufacturers an easier time kind of packaging all the components they need in order to make it an EV. So you do tend to see kind of EVs and crossovers and SUVs kind of leading the market to a certain extent. Three other things that happened: infrastructure, policy, and the incentives all came into being to kind of effectively underpin the power of the products. And particularly on the incentive side, the taxes that Matt from McBride's will tell you more about in the second half have been a key driver of uptake of EVs as well. On the policy side, we know that we've got a phase out of the sales of non-electrified vehicles in 2030, and then from 2035 onwards, everything will be an EV. In terms of building charging infrastructure, there's a lot of parties kind of coming together in order to be able to create the right things. A quick primer on how an EV works. Kilowatts is the power, which is effectively the size of the motor. Kilowatt hours is the energy and refers to the battery size. It's a very, very low-tech device mechanically, many fewer moving parts, much less maintenance required for an EV. And so EV servicing is much less of a necessity than it is for petrol and diesel cars, to the extent that Tesla, you don't need to have a Tesla service in order to maintain the warranty. If you don't service your Tesla at all for 4 years, your warranty still remains valid, which is an interesting challenge actually for the way that cars are sold and maintained, and all the people who do those jobs, within that industry. Is it manual or automatic? Well, in most cases, no, it isn't. There's no actuated gearbox at all. In terms of licensing, you can drive an EV having passed the automatic driving test. And indeed, half of young people now are beginning to opt for an automatic only driving test because they don't see themselves driving anything other than an EV. And they effectively have a single gear that takes them to their top speed, which is often limited, particularly in the more the mass market vehicles, to 150 kilometers an hour, which equates to about 11,000 RPM in a BMW i3. But there's effectively a single gear for most of those vehicles. They're much more energy efficient. You get 4 miles per kilowatt hour compared to only 1.4 miles for a diesel car, even at 70 miles per gallon. Most of an internal combustion engine energy conversion is into heat, and a lot of that is lost. We're kind of 30 to 40% efficient. An EV is more like 90% efficient. You do get some heat losses, but nearly all of that energy in the battery is converted to power. The battery size, as I'm sure you're aware, everyone knows about kind of range anxiety, with EVs, and PHEVs tend to have kind of a relatively small usable battery, which kind of gives you kind of 30 to 40 miles if you're careful. BEVs now are getting up to 100 kilowatt hours usable. I think the largest battery is now in the new Mercedes EQS, 108 kilowatt hours, and I'm sure the good people at Lucid and Rivian will probably beat that when their vehicles come to market soon. They do drive differently. The biggest difference is in the braking, there is effectively regenerative and contactless braking, and effectively the motor is used to slow the car down. It's adjustable in quite a few EVs, but it's possible as a result of that to drive a lot of EVs almost on one pedal. So you effectively brake just by lifting off the accelerator. And that sounds, if you've not driven an EV, it could sound a bit weird, and it is, but only for about the first 10-20 minutes. It becomes very, very natural once you kind of get over the kind of initial nervousness of that kind of type of driving. The other thing that a lot of people know about EVs is that they're pretty quick off the mark. The peak power and torque occurs in an EV between 0 and 45 miles an hour normally. The power and torque kind of drops off as the revs kind of go up a little bit in an EV, which is the completely opposite way round to an internal combustion engine car. And so you do end up kind of driving them differently. It's actually much more, relaxing. You use the regenerative braking. You tend to kind of brake earlier. There's much kind of less kind of sharp kind of braking and accelerating. It's much more in tune. It's really good driving an EV in traffic, simply because it's so much more relaxing than driving a manual or even an automatic car in traffic. Clearly, it's much quieter inside and out. Low speed noise is an issue. with an EV, but only up to about 20 miles an hour, whereas road noise at about that point kind of takes over, and EVs, generate the same noise going past as kind of any other car. More recent EVs are fitted with low-speed sounds. There's a kind of an interesting competition amongst EV manufacturers to see who can make their car sound most like a dodgy sound effect from a 1950s flying saucer movie. And so, they're beginning to kind of experiment with the kinds of sounds that they're using. But it is worth saying that you do need to be probably more alert, particularly in like supermarket car parks, that those sorts of environments. My BMW i3 didn't have a low speed sound, but I did. I was lucky enough to pay for the upgraded stereo, so I just wound the windows down and played drum and bass everywhere I drove around Bexley Heath, and that seemed to do the trick. For the majority of people who are worried about how an EV drives, separate to whether they can afford to run one, acquire one, live with one, etc., one drive tends to convince them that they're a better vehicle in terms of the drive and the experience than an internal combustion engine. So if you're thinking about buying an electric vehicle, what's it like to live with a BEV? Well, this isn't so much applicable now as vehicles, are beginning to come onto the market with larger batteries. But the mantra always used to be ABC, always be charging, so that you would effectively, pick up a charge whenever one was available. The obvious place to charge is at home. Easier to charge if you've got a driveway, of course, because you can have your own charger on it. Interesting, my company Trojan delivers a solution which means you can charge at home if you don't have a driveway, and you can park outside your house. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Also, obviously, if you've got a house with, so that's not my house, by the way, that's my folks' house. If you've got a house with solar panels on it, you can charge for free with zero carbon electricity right from the source, which is another interesting kind of outcome of kind of EVs, in that you can effectively generate your own electricity for your car. It's always a good idea to charge when you're kind of out and about, and if you get an opportunity. Anyone who's been in the Asda in Bexley Heath knows that will probably know, if they've been in the car park, knows that there've been 4 charge points just near the entrance for actually a long time. The Asda in Bexley Heath was one of the first supermarkets in the UK to get electric vehicle charging. That prototype BMW that you can see there, that picture was taken in 2013 when I was running around in that, and kind of I had those charge points all to myself because there weren't that many EVs in Bexley Heath back then. But supermarkets and places where you park for a while are the kinds of places that do need electric vehicle infrastructure to be put in. And those charge points in that supermarket, and most supermarket charge points, are the same speed as kind of home charge points. We tend to call them kind of slow to fast. So for the numbers minded, kind of in the 7 kilowatts range, restoring around about 20 to 25 miles of range in an hour. Of course, on long journeys, particularly in some of the smaller BEVs, you do need to charge up, probably every kind of 70, 80 miles. You've probably seen the motorway service station rapid charges that operate at 50 kilowatt hours or above. On direct current, and they can effectively recharge a vehicle much faster. We're talking about if you can charge for a whole hour at 50 kilowatts, you're kind of getting close to 175 to 200 miles of range back. 50 kilowatts was the standard for a long time, but most rapid chargers that are installed now charge at 100 kilowatts, 150 kilowatts, even up to 350 kilowatts for some super high-powered charging, and some cars, normally at the expensive end of the market, that can take charges up to about 300 kilowatts. And so most of the cars, even the mass market cars coming onto the market at the moment, the Volkswagen ID 3, which is a very popular EV, has done a lot of volume in the last year, kind of a Volkswagen Golf sized EV that charges at 115 kilowatts. Some of the slightly more expensive ones charge at 150, and that's that's the point at which EVs become kind of really viable, because you can kind of fully recharge them almost in the time it takes you to stop at a motorway service station, go to the loo, and grab a drink. EVs are now, there's much more range. I can't drive the full range of the EVs that are out there without needing to stop to go to the loo. So it's more bladder anxiety for me than range anxiety. Even if you drive a PHEV, like a BMW i8 or more commonly a Mitsubishi Outlander, it's still a good idea to grab some charge whenever you can. The charges at Blue Water, the pod point charges near the John Lewis car park, I remember when they were brand new and very few people were using them. Unfortunately, there are still only 8 at Blue Water, which is about 500 short of the number that they need. And so it's very, very difficult to get there early enough to get a charge there now. But there are some places in and around the borough with lots and lots of chargers. Over next door in Greenwich, there are 150 kind of 7 kilowatt chargers in the car parks of Primark and the Sainsbury's and Marks and Spencer's at Charlton. So that's a good place to go for EV charging. And there are other ways of grabbing a charge as well. The reason I put this picture up is to kind of answer the question, what happens to old EV batteries? A lot of people will say EVs are bad for the planet because the batteries will end up in landfill. I'm here to tell you that an EV battery will never end up in a landfill site. You can do so much more with them, even when their life in the car has come to an end. One of the things that a company called Connected Energy are doing is taking old EV batteries that you can see in the green cabinet there, connecting them to a big solar array that you can see, and effectively charging and creating rapid charging technology based on entirely stored electricity. And that's a fantastic use for EV batteries. Also in the home, in the future, we'll be taking old batteries out of cars and sticking them in the home to use as effectively home storage for solar, other micro generation, grid balancing, and all those other things that enables us to decarbonize our energy grid. And so there are all kinds of opportunities to take charge. There are also some innovative charging solutions required for people particularly who don't have driveways. Lamppost charging is a very, very good early market intervention. They're not particularly high powered, and obviously there aren't that many lampposts on a street, and so you can't really kind of charge all 35 million cars in the UK from lamppost charging. But they're a very interesting way to effectively deliver charging onto streets where people don't have driveways. But they are relatively slow, and it is possible to take 2 days to charge up a Tesla on a lamppost charger, which, if I may kind of blow our own trumpet for a little bit, is where Trojan comes in. Trojan is a new company that is effectively installing flat and flush sockets on the ground, which are then accessed via a lance that we effectively give to our customers. And it's effectively for people who can charge right outside their front door. It's not public charging as such, because you can't give a lance to everybody in the world, but it does provide a really, really useful solution to the residential on-street charging conundrum, i.e. how do people charge at home without a driveway? And we've got a number of projects in and around London. We've got nothing in Bexley, unfortunately. We still always maintain hopes that we can do, and we can kind of roll this out in conjunction with local authorities, and are doing with local authorities around the UK. So quickly, I've got a few minutes left, so I'm just going to talk briefly about the kind of the infrastructure, because one of the challenges that people cite is the number of charge points available for use. The number of charge points in London is accelerating quite quickly, but probably not quite as quickly as the number of vehicles is. Yesterday was a big day in EVs with the Model Y announcement, but the Mayor also announced an update to the Transport for London electric vehicle strategy, which I'm happy to say in my time there I was able to contribute to in some small way. they've effectively come up with, you know, targets for the numbers of charges that are required of each particular type. And you can see that regardless of whether the forecast is and what the scenarios are, depending on how uptake happens, we are, you know, an order of magnitude away from the numbers of charges that we need, both in terms of rapid, you know, the big DC 50 kilowatt plus units, and also the public kind of slower destination and residential on-street units. And so it's incumbent on organisations like mine, Trojan, to effectively, you know, create compelling propositions for local authorities to be able to, you know, answer some of these questions and deploy technology at scale. I'm pleased to say that we've got contracts in place to deliver 645 fast charge points in London in 2022. We're not the only company that's doing that. There are lots of other companies doing that as well. And of course, we remain open to new projects and new offers and new partnerships all the time. Quick bit on the impact of EVs, electricity consumption and emissions. Is there going to be enough electricity? The short answer is yes. Electricity usage in the UK has dropped considerably over the last 15 years, and just the amount that it's dropped is enough for around about 24 of the 35 million light vehicles in the UK to be fully electrified. And that electricity consumption would only get us back to where we were in 2005. The carbon intensity of the grid has dropped considerably. It's one of the areas where the UK really does lead the world. EVs get cleaner effectively as you drive them as they get older, and the UK has also recently announced that will be zero by 2035 to coincide with the phase out date of non-EV vehicles being sold. The life cycle emissions are much lower than ICE. There is a premium in terms of more energy is required to build one, but around about 16,000 kilometres is the offset point in Europe. So once a car gets to 16,000 miles, 16,000 kilometres, about 10,000 miles, it then becomes, in terms of total life cycle emissions, better for the environment than an internal combustion engine. And as the upfront energy gets cleaner, an EV gets cleaner in the build more quickly than an internal combustion engine car does. And so that's an important factor to think about as well. Air quality, zero tailpipe emissions. Obviously, that's kind of turned the focus onto the other particulate emissions that vehicles create. Because EVs brake contactlessly for a lot of the time, the reduced emissions from the brake pads last way longer on an EV than they currently do. And Tesla have claimed that if you drive your car relatively carefully over its life, the brake pads could last the entire life of the car and never need replacing. So that's good from a maintenance point of view, but it also means that the particulate emissions are being cut right down. Tyre manufacturers are now working on low particulate tyres. It's interesting that the EV kind of market has kick-started that research, because tyre emissions were a very, very small part of the overall transport particulate emissions. But in the future, tyre emissions are likely to be the majority of transport emissions. And now, so because, you know, the focus will move on to tyres, that technology is now in development. Could have been developed 50 years ago, but wasn't. And there are also tyre particle capture systems in development using electrostatics to effectively capture the particles, and so they don't actually enter the atmosphere, that they're retained within the car. The longer term challenges, it's all around the supply chain, and there are three factors: the availability of the materials, particularly some of the more exotic minerals that go into the car, lithium and cobalt, etc. The environmental impact of the way those materials are produced, and also the labour conditions involved in their production. And it's interesting that the development and research going on in batteries can actually solve all three of those issues. You can use batteries that don't need quite as many exotic materials, or might be able to eliminate them altogether. You can create effectively cheaper batteries, which give you some money in the supply chain and some margin to be able to improve and mine and create in a more environmentally sustainable way, and also improve the labour conditions associated with the people doing the work. So it's really battery development which is at the heart of trying to make EVs, you know, better for everyone on the planet as well as the planet itself. It's fair to say that some parts of the world are way behind the UK on their grid decarbonisation. So although even if you drive an EV on coal power, it is cleaner than driving a petrol or a diesel car, it's not by nearly enough. And those countries need to kind of decarbonise their grid in order to really get the benefits from switching to EVs. And heavy vehicles are getting more viable, but they're still a challenge. There's no two ways about it. You do need a big battery for a fire engine or a refuse truck, and big batteries kind of add weight and take up space on the vehicle. Things are getting better, but there are other technologies which may well come to bear, hydrogen, liquefied gas, etc., in terms of lower carbon, heavier vehicles. Quick total cost of ownership piece. Higher purchase cost will probably get to parity in 2024. The lower running cost offsets the higher purchase cost. You can get down to 5 pence per mile or less if you've got a cheaper overnight tariff and you charge at home. That's very favourable compared with an EV. With an internal combustion engine vehicle. In a few cases, you can actually make your EV free if you run kind of a B segment car. So you're kind of your Ford Fiesta, Vauxhall Corsa. You drive a kind of a higher mileage. If you can charge at home and you can charge at a kind of a very, very cheap rate, then if you put all the maths into a spreadsheet, it turns out that leasing and powering a new EV is less than simply the petrol bill that you've got at the moment. That tends to be in the kind of the higher mileages, and people who are perhaps spending £200 to £250 a month on petrol. But there are plenty of those people and there's an obvious business case for those people to make the switch. And so thank you very much for listening. I've run a couple of minutes over than I was hoping to, so apologies to Matt for taking some of his time. But I'd like to say thanks a lot and hand over to Matt now for a bit more of an in-depth look at some of the financials surrounding EVs. So I'm going to stop sharing and Matt, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to try and press the right button and share my screen. Let's see how we go with that. Ooh, I think we're getting there. Thank you very much. Yes, there we go. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much to Mark. That was certainly the electrifying, I think, part of the presentation. I'm going to be doing the more sort of taxing part, so please bear with me. My name's Matt Reed. I'm a business tax director at McBride's Chartered Accountants. McBride's has, in fact, we're going to be celebrating sort of 50 years next year of providing accountancy and taxation advice in the sort of Sidcup Bexley area, and we service a lot of local businesses and individuals in regard to their sort of accountancy needs. As Mark sort of highlighted, a lot of the growth in take up of electric vehicles has been sort of promoted by the sort of tax incentives that are available for electric cars, and I'm going to sort of set out in sort of two parts, or mainly two parts, what those incentives are. I'm going to start off by talking about what the incentives are for businesses on purchasing electric vehicles and sort of the infrastructure that goes with those vehicles. Firstly, in terms of sort of pure electric vehicles, for a number of years, we've had the ability to claim sort of 100% sort of tax relief on the purchase cost of a zero emission electric vehicle. So they're the sort of the pure sort of battery EVs that Mark was talking about, not the sort of plug-in hybrid ones. And that sort of 100% sort of first year allowance means that businesses can claim for the full cost from pre-tax profits in the year of purchase. That same treatment applies to zero emission electric vans, but as Mark suggested, they're sort of less in circulation due to the sort of restraints on the size of such vehicles. But for a company or indeed a self-employed individual purchasing an electric car or van costing 40,000, this can produce a tax saving of £7,600, and the saving is even higher for, say, a self-employed individual who's taxed at the sort of highest 45% tax rate. For hybrid vehicles. So they're the ones where there is a combustion engine as well as sort of battery power. The sort of tax advantages are not so great. As he says there, cars with CO2 emissions not exceeding 50 grams can claim a tax deduction of 18% per year. And for cars with higher emissions, the rate of deduction is sort of reduced to 6%. So clearly there's an incentive to buy a sort of pure zero emission electric car. The situation is slightly different with hybrid vans, where they can still be eligible to a claim to what us sort of tax advisors know as the annual investment allowance, and that provides for again for a sort of 100% tax write-off in the year of purchase. Again, sort of looking at businesses, you know, electric car charging points and sort of other infrastructure, there is available a 100% sort of first year allowance for the cost of installing such sort of charging points and other infrastructure. So again, that means you can claim tax relief for the full cost in the year of purchase. What was sort of introduced recently, or in this year's budget, or the first budget of this year anyway, we're due another one in October, was this super deduction, which provides for 130% first year allowance that can apply to sort of qualifying expenditure incurred up to the 31st of March 2023. Now, one sort of slightly disappointing point with this super deduction is that it can only apply to limited companies. It can't apply to, or it's not available to self-employed individuals or partnerships. And as it sort of suggests there, it allows for a company to deduct 130% of the cost of a qualifying asset from pre-tax profits. In terms of its applicability to sort of electric vehicles, it can't apply to, or is not allowed to be applied to, the purchase of electric cars, but can be applied to the purchase of commercial vans, and also, you know, vehicle charge points and other sort of infrastructure where they're installed at business premises. So in terms of what that can do in terms of a van, that can produce, you know, a greater tax saving than the 100% sort of first year allowance that I sort of mentioned previously. But it's only available up until, or for purchases made before the 31st of March 2023. Now they're the sort of main, I think the main sort of tax incentives for businesses looking to purchase electric vehicles. For employees, there are again incentives for employees being provided electric vehicles as company cars. When your employer gives you the benefit of a company car, they're also giving you a tax liability in effect, because that provision of that car will be liable to a benefit in kind tax charge. And also employers pay Class 1 national insurance on the amount of the benefit that the employee is liable to. Now, the taxable amount is calculated by reference to a percentage of the list price of the car, and that percentage is determined by the CO2 emissions of the relevant vehicle. Now, for hybrid cars, the percentage varies between 2% to 14%. And also for, well, in fact, for vans, if for a zero emission van, the percentage is currently nil. What's also more relevant to individuals or employees is for pure electric vehicles, the sort of relevant percentages have been set at 1% for this sort of current tax year and 2% for next tax year. We don't have details of what will happen in subsequent years, but I think the expectation is that these very sort of low percentage rates will continue as an incentive for employers to provide employees with electric vehicles as company cars. And just there is a sort of little table that sets out what those sort of very low percentages means in terms of an individual who is provided with an electric car as a company car. For an employee who's liable at the basic rate, they pay the princely sum of £80 on a £40,000 electric vehicle in this current tax year. For a higher rate individual, it's 160. Those amounts sort of double for the next tax year, but again, the amounts are still very low compared to the sort of list price of the vehicle that they're being allowed to drive. Moving on to sort of when you're driving around in your car and needing to charge it, I mean, with a company car where an employer pays for the cost of charging a company provided electric vehicle, that is not classified as or there's no sort of taxable fuel benefit, which is another incentive, because employees who drive petrol or diesel company cars and their employer pays for the fuel in those cars, there is a taxable benefit which can, unless you're sort of a very high sort of mileage driver, will usually mean that the tax you will pay is greater than the fuel cost, but that doesn't apply for company provided electric vehicles. And in where the driver of the electric vehicle pays for the electricity to power it, they're allowed to be reimbursed for the cost of that at a set rate of 4p a mile. And where an employer allows employees to charge their own electric vehicles at the workplace, so this is different, this is not a company provided car, this is an employee driving their own car to work, their employer can allow them to charge that vehicle at the workplace, and that will not give rise to any sort of taxable benefit implications. And where an employee uses his or own electric car for business journeys, the company can pay the normal sort of tax-free allowances to cover the cost of that. So that's sort of 45p a mile for 10,000 miles driven, or and then 25p a mile thereafter, which when you sort of compare that to sort of Mark's sort of mention of the running cost of an electric vehicle being 5p a mile, then obviously, you know, that's quite a sort of profit in there for employees using their own electric vehicles for business journeys. And another sort of incentive for employees or employees and employers that want to sort of provide electric vehicles to their staff is sort of by doing so under sort of salary sacrifice arrangements. You know, this is an arrangement between an employee and an employer, whereby the employee agrees to give up a sort of percentage of their salary in return for the provision of a benefit, in this case, the provision of an electric vehicle. And by doing so, they expect the benefit in kind charge to give rise to a lower tax charge than the salary that they've foregone. There were changes, because I think a lot of employers were offering salary sacrifice arrangements, and it was costing the Exchequer a lot of sort of lost tax and national insurance contributions, and they changed the rules 3 or 4 years ago, but they didn't change the rules in regards to sort of low emission cars. In this case, it's cars with CO2 emissions of less than 75 grams, which means that salary sacrifice arrangements for sort of electric and hybrid cars are still sort of very tax efficient for both employee and employer. Just sort of moving on to sort of VAT implications. Under current law, an electric vehicle is still, or an electric car is still viewed as a car for VAT purposes. And what that means is that VAT is not recoverable on the purchase cost of the vehicle unless it can be demonstrated that the car is only available for business purposes. That in practice is very difficult to achieve. The typical examples are cars used by driving instructors or by hire companies, but that is recoverable on the purchase of an electric van and sort of other commercial vehicles, and on sort of the infrastructure, sort of electric charging points and so on, where they're sort of purchased by a business. A business is also able to recover VAT where employees charge an electric vehicle at their business premises. This can be done by either sort of recovering in full and then making an output charge to reflect the private use of the vehicle, because unless the car is being used solely for business purposes, there is always going to be an element of private use which HMRC are going to expect the VAT not to be recovered on. Or it can be achieved by just recovering the VAT on the business element only, which will mean there's a need to keep sort of mileage records by the employee of what business journeys they've undertaken and what sort of private mileage they've done. And I think that's, you know, a fairly sort of swift summary of the tax incentives that are available for electric sort of vehicles, both sort of cars and vans. As Mark was saying, you know, certainly that those tax incentives are, though, helping to sort of drive the current sort of uptake in electric vehicles. And, you know, as far as we're aware at the moment, they're continuing to be available for the foreseeable future, but there will certainly come a time when they will be withdrawn, presumably on the basis that the vast majority of people will be encouraged to and be using electric vehicles as their sort of primary mode of transport.
Wow, thank you so much, guys. Let's get a few questions in, because there's been quite a few, and this was very, very informative. First question is, when can we be expecting more affordable electric vehicles?
Okay, so yeah, no, it's a great question, and you know the sticker price of a car is the thing that still most people focus on when deciding whether they can afford to buy one, and so the price of an electric vehicle is driven purely by one thing: it's the battery cost. And back in, you know, kind of 10 years ago, batteries were kind of $600 to $700 per kilowatt hour. Batteries are now approaching $100 per kilowatt hour. When they get down to kind of $80, $70 per kilowatt hour, i.e. a battery pack for a car comes in at around £4,000 to £5,000, then it's at that point that they will effectively reach parity with internal combustion engine vehicles. But it won't stop there. The battery development, as I was talking about, that can solve all kinds of the challenges, is being done all over the world by all kinds of different organizations, car companies, battery companies, other electronics companies. Everyone, you know, wants a kind of a piece of, you know, this future, and so certainly 2024 is when a lot of commentators say that we'll start to see a kind of parity. That coincides with a number of manufacturers saying that it's from 2024 2025 we'll start to sell mostly electric vehicles, you know, from within our ranges, and so they're coming, and so the way that EVs are penetrating, you know, into the market at the moment are based mainly around the business case in terms of usage. Can you charge it cheaply relative to the number of miles you need to drive? If the answer is yes, then a more expensive purchase price is less of a problem. But you know, we need to have loads and loads of new electric vehicles, so that there's lots of second-hand electric vehicles to buy as well.
And on that note, for batteries, how is the battery system going to be updated or changed to allow more cars to be built so that we don't run out of the raw materials needed?
Yeah. So interestingly, some of the materials are referred to as rare earth metals. That's got nothing to do with how much of it there is. It's effectively a chemical term in terms of where they reside on the periodic table. But lithium, which is the key component of battery chemistry at the moment, is actually one of the world's most abundant minerals. It just happens to come from places that are, far flung and, have some of them, have some challenges with, labour and environmental, activities and everything else. It is within, that cheaper battery kind of cost enables the research to go into kind of various other chemistries that relies less on exotic materials and more on batteries that don't require so much of those materials. But there is certainly a case of understanding that in the future, not every car will be a long range car. There will be, when the range and the segment coverage starts to fill in, there will be people who will be perfectly happy buying a 100 or 150 mile range car that might have a battery of 30 to 40 kilowatt hours. According to the AA driver survey they do every year, there's a surprising amount of cars in the UK that never get any further than 20 miles away from home. It's something in the kind of the high teens of percent, so it's 17, 18%. And so for all of those cars could switch to an EV, overnight and have and take up, a smaller range of materials. But yeah, you're right, absolutely. It's going to be a case of finding those new chemistries, finding those new materials that are more abundant, rarer, less risky. But all of that research is going on.
Amazing. One more question, but this one is for Matt. The plan seems to be great from a business to government aspect in terms of pricing and tax. However, it seems to be for purchasing for private use. There are no current benefits. Will this slow down our run to net zero?
Well, I think that's a sort of question for both of us. I mean, I think certainly at one point, Martin, you will confirm that there were sort of incentives for private individuals to purchase electric vehicles, but that was withdrawn. I'm not sure how many years ago. Was it sort of 2 or 3 years ago?
Well, there's still the thing called the plug-in car grant, which started off at £5,000 off the list price in 2011 and has gone through a number of iterations. It only now applies to kind of cheaper full electric vehicles, full BEVs, but there is still some. But it's probably, in line with, that parity point I made about 2024. It's probably going to be withdrawn within the next few years. There's some cheap some incentives to kind of get a home charger, so the government currently give you some money off of that. But yeah, the levers that government are able to pull for private individuals are much less. I mean, one of the biggest is the fact that you can't put fuel tax on electricity because you can generate it yourself. So that's actually, you could say that the government haven't done anything, but they haven't like reduced the cost of anything. But what they haven't done is apply a fuel tax type model to EVs.
Okay.
What about road tax? Is that are they exempt? I'm not entirely sure.
EVs have a zero vehicle excise duty charge at the moment.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, thank you guys so much. And thank you everyone for tuning in.